The polished floors of the high-end boutique reflected the bright lights overhead, creating an almost surreal atmosphere of perfection. The air was filled with the scent of freshly printed designer labels, expensive perfume, and the faint sound of soft jazz playing in the background. Chloe stood in front of a full-length mirror, carefully adjusting her sleek, pearl-white dress as her fingers traced the lines of her expensive accessories. The necklace that hung elegantly around her neck shimmered under the store lights, a rare heirloom passed down from her grandmother, a piece that symbolized her family's legacy and wealth. It was priceless to her, a symbol of everything she had inherited and everything she had come to expect from the world around her. Chloe's world was one of privilege. She had been born into wealth, the kind that most could only dream of. Designer clothes, luxury cars, five-star vacations, and the finest everything. She had grown accustomed to getting what she wanted when she wanted it. But beyond the surface of her opulent life, Chloe had never known struggle. She had never been forced to make a decision between two choices she could barely afford. People like Chloe lived in a bubble, isolated from the reality that the majority of the world experienced on a daily basis. This was the world she inhabited, and nothing ever seemed to touch her. But on this particular day, as Chloe stood admiring her reflection, something was different, something that would turn her perfect world upside down. As she twirled in front of the mirror, admiring how the fabric of her dress flowed effortlessly, she heard the soft jingle of the boutique door opening behind her. Turning her head, Chloe barely glanced over her shoulder. In walked a figure that instantly caught her eye, a girl in tattered clothes, face pale and worn, with a hint of dirt on her hands and cheeks. Her hair was matted and messy, and her eyes seemed distant, as though she were not entirely present in the world around her. The girl's clothes were far from the refined fashion of the boutique, and she moved with a hesitant energy, unsure of herself in the midst of so much wealth and beauty. Chloe's eyes narrowed instinctively. It wasn't so much the girl's appearance that caught her attention, but rather the sense of intrusion. The way she seemed to be out of place in this world of high society. Chloe felt a flicker of judgment in her chest, a familiar sensation that she had learned to keep buried but never truly let go of. People like that, she thought to herself. People who didn't belong here. The girl wandered through the aisles, passing by the racks of expensive dresses and bags, her eyes scanning the items with a quiet desperation, as if she were searching for something, anything, to help her feel less invisible in this world. Chloe turned her attention back to the mirror, dismissing the girl with a sense of superiority. She didn't belong here, and Chloe knew it. But the unease lingered at the back of her mind as she checked her phone, scrolling through social media to distract herself from the uninvited presence in the boutique. She had learned to ignore such sights, homeless people, the poor, the downtrodden. They were a part of the landscape she passed by every day on her way to work or school, people who didn't matter to her. She was used to keeping a safe distance. Today, though, she felt uneasy. It wasn't until several minutes later, when she was inspecting the latest collection of handbags, that the unease morphed into something much worse. As Chloe turned her attention to the display case at the front of the store, her gaze fell on a stunning necklace, a perfect match to the one she was wearing. It sparkled brilliantly, with diamonds that caught the light at every angle, and a delicate platinum chain that seemed to shimmer like a piece of the sky itself. Chloe's heart skipped a beat as she noticed that the necklace, which she had admired earlier, was now missing from the display. She froze. A sharp panic surged through her, and her first thought was absurd yet immediate. Someone took it. It couldn't have just disappeared. The boutique was upscale, too upscale for this kind of mistake. She checked again, eyes darting over the counter, scanning the case for the missing piece. She wasn't mistaken. The necklace was gone. In a moment of raw fear and confusion, Chloe's mind began to race. She had admired that necklace for days. She had planned to buy it for herself as a perfect addition to her wardrobe, a gift to herself for everything she had worked for. But now it was gone. Had someone stolen it? Her heart pounded as she looked around the store. And then her gaze fell on her, the girl, the one who had entered the boutique only moments earlier. The girl whose clothes were filthy, whose eyes were clouded with fear and uncertainty. Chloe's mind flashed with suspicion. It had to be her. The poor girl, who wandered through the store with no clear sense of purpose, must have snatched the necklace when no one was looking. Her gut instinct told her that it was her. It had to be. Chloe's blood boiled as she approached the girl, her every step fueled by a sense of entitlement that only someone from her world could understand. "What are you doing here?" Chloe's voice was cold, demanding, cutting through the stillness of the boutique. The girl jumped, clearly startled. She stammered for a moment, unable to respond. I was just looking around," the girl said, her voice small, shaky. "Looking around?" Chloe's tone grew sharper. "Don't you know this is a high-end boutique? People like you don't just wander in here. You're making a scene." Chloe's gaze flickered to the now empty display case. "Where is it?" "The necklace. The one from the case." The girl's eyes widened in shock, and her hands trembled. I didn't take it. I swear," she said, her voice nearly breaking. Chloe's mind was racing. Lies. This girl was lying. There was no way she could have missed the moment when the necklace had disappeared. There was no way the girl had simply wandered past and somehow, without even knowing it, had taken the necklace. It had to be her. "You think I'm stupid?" Chloe snapped, her voice now loud enough to draw the attention of the store manager, who had appeared from behind the counter. "She took it. I know it. She's just trying to play innocent." The manager stood frozen for a moment, looking between Chloe and the girl, before walking over to the display. His face twisted with confusion and concern as he carefully inspected the remaining jewelry. "Ma'am, we're missing a necklace," he said, his voice low but firm. He turned to the girl. "Did you see anything suspicious?" The girl shook her head vigorously, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. She was starting to back away now, her hands raised in a defensive gesture. "I didn't do anything. I didn't take anything, please." Chloe wasn't listening. Her suspicion had turned into certainty. The girl had stolen it. She could see it in the girl's eyes, the way she was acting so guilty. She could feel the anger swelling in her chest. How dare someone like this try to take something that didn't belong to her? The manager seemed unsure, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Chloe, feeling the weight of her family's reputation and the certainty of her own righteousness, stepped forward. "She stole it," Chloe repeated, her voice rising now. "I'm telling you, she's the one." The store manager hesitated again. The tension was palpable, and the girl looked as though she might break down at any moment, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. But Chloe wasn't going to back down. She knew what she had seen, what she had felt. She was right. And so the confrontation began, a battle of suspicion, perception, and bias that would soon reveal truths that no one, least of all Chloe, could have predicted. The tension in the boutique felt suffocating as Chloe stood rigid, glaring at the girl who was still trying to plead her innocence. The accusations hung in the air like an invisible weight, heavy and unrelenting. Chloe's eyes, cold and hard with certainty, locked on the poor girl who was now visibly shaking in fear. The store manager stood between them, unsure of how to proceed, but Chloe's mind was already set. She couldn't help but think about the world she lived in, a world where things just worked. Everything made sense. You knew your place, and people knew theirs. There was no ambiguity. People with money got what they wanted, when they wanted it, and those without were often invisible to her, relegated to the shadows of society. Chloe had always lived in a reality where she could rely on the predictability of things, where her social standing protected her from the chaos of life. But what did she know about real struggle? About the things that shaped people's lives when they had nothing left to hold on to? Chloe had been born into wealth, to a family whose name alone carried power. The Blackwoods had been a staple of high society for generations, each member more privileged than the last. Her father, Charles Blackwood, was a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Her mother, Evelyn, was a former beauty queen turned philanthropist, known for her high-profile charity galas. Chloe had never known anything else. From the moment she could walk, she had been immersed in a world of luxury, designer clothes, private tutors, and endless opportunities. But despite this, something deep inside her felt hollow, as if the surface beauty of her life couldn't completely fill the void inside of her. From the outside, Chloe's life was perfect, but within the walls of the mansion, the pressures were suffocating. She had been taught to behave in a certain way, to project an image of perfection to the world. She had been told time and time again that nothing else mattered but appearances, status, and wealth. She had grown up in a world where the right people did things, and the wrong ones didn't. Chloe had always been told that people like her, the ones with money, status, and power, deserved everything they had. It was just the way the world worked, they said. Her parents had taught her that success was defined by wealth and what one could buy with it. But somewhere, beneath the glittering exterior of her life, Chloe had begun to wonder whether this system was truly fair. Her self-image had always been tied to her family's wealth. She equated money with success, social validation, and the belief that she was superior to those who didn't have what she did. She had never been taught to question these assumptions because, in her world, everyone else was expected to be grateful for their position in life. They were the lucky ones who should bow in reverence to the people who had earned their status. The poor, the underprivileged, the ones without a voice. These were the people Chloe had been taught to ignore or, at best, pity from a distance. Enter Sarah. Sarah's life, on the other hand, had been a series of harsh lessons in survival. She hadn't been born with any privileges, not the kind that Chloe had. She had come from the opposite world, one of struggle, hardship, and constant uncertainty. If you asked Sarah about her early years, she would tell you a story of a family once full of hope, but gradually worn down by the relentless pressures of life. There was no grand family fortune, no mansion, no summer vacations in Paris. Her parents had done their best to give her and her siblings a stable life, but the weight of financial strain eventually broke them apart. Sarah's father had been an ordinary factory worker. Her mother, a waitress, worked long shifts at a local diner. They had never been able to make ends meet with ease, but they had tried. And for a time, things had been okay. Sarah remembered the family's small apartment, the cozy warmth of the living room, where her parents would talk about their dreams of a better life, and where Sarah and her siblings would sit on the floor, feeling safe. But safety, like everything else, was fleeting. When Sarah was only 12, her father lost his job due to a factory closure. The blow was devastating. It wasn't just the loss of income. It was the loss of stability. Her father, who had always been a pillar of strength, began to unravel. His search for another job turned desperate. After months of rejection, he became bitter and withdrawn, his once jovial nature replaced by the weight of defeat. He turned to alcohol to numb the pain, which only made things worse. Her mother tried to keep the family together, working longer hours. But eventually, the stress took its toll. The apartment was lost. The family was broken. For Sarah, it wasn't just the physical loss that hurt. It was the emotional toll. The disconnect that crept into the lives of her parents. The silence that replaced laughter. She had to grow up faster than any child should, learning how to fend for herself as she watched her family disintegrate. By the time Sarah was 16, she had already learned what it meant to have nothing. Her mother had moved into a small one-bedroom unit with Sarah and her younger brother, but the situation only worsened. Sarah began skipping school to work odd jobs, washing dishes at a greasy diner, delivering groceries for a local store, just to help make ends meet. But despite her best efforts, there were more nights than she could count when they would go to bed hungry. They relied on food banks, charity dinners, and the occasional kindness of strangers. It was at this point that Sarah began to feel invisible to the world around her. She was just another face in the crowd, another young girl with no future. By the time she was 18, she had dropped out of school. Her life was now a constant search for work, any work. But with no education and no formal skills, the opportunities available to her were limited. She tried to hold on to some semblance of hope, but the world seemed bent on reminding her how little value she had. That's when she started to believe what the world around her had always told her, that people like her didn't deserve anything, that they were just a burden to society. The streets became her reality, and she didn't have the luxury of wondering what it would be like to live another life. Every day was an act of survival. She slept on benches, in abandoned buildings, wherever she could find a little bit of shelter from the cold. Her clothes became dirtier with each passing day, her hair tangled and unkempt. Sarah had tried to find work at a local cafe, but they had turned her away, telling her she didn't have the right look for their brand. She had become a ghost in the world, a person who barely existed. And so, when Sarah found herself standing at the threshold of that high-end boutique, her last hope for some semblance of dignity, she felt out of place, unsure of why she had walked in there in the first place. The polished, perfect world inside the store seemed so far removed from the life she knew. But she had heard rumors about free samples from customers who didn't finish their purchases, and for a moment, she had hoped there might be some food left unattended in a corner. Anything, just to fill her stomach for a few hours. But that was when Chloe had noticed her. That was when everything changed. Sarah hadn't meant to draw attention. She was just trying to stay under the radar, to stay unnoticed. But Chloe saw her. And in that moment, Sarah became something else. Someone to be judged, to be accused. The conflict between worlds. Chloe's world, with its polished floors and designer clothes, had been built on a structure of assumption and privilege. It was a world where people like Sarah didn't exist unless they were seen through the lens of charity or disdain. For Chloe, this boutique was a symbol of her success, the world where everything made sense, and everyone knew their place. But Sarah's world, her harsh, unforgiving world, was one where survival meant doing whatever it took to get by. She wasn't looking for trouble. She wasn't trying to stir up drama. She was just trying to make it through another day. Yet, in this one fateful moment, their worlds collided, and Chloe had already made her judgment. Purpose of this background. In this section, the contrasting backgrounds of Chloe and Sarah are explored in depth, helping the audience understand the emotional and psychological motivations behind their actions. Chloe's life of privilege and Sarah's struggles for survival paint a clear picture of their differing realities. This emotional background sets the stage for the conflict to unfold, highlighting the themes of prejudice, assumptions, and the clash between wealth and poverty, which will drive the rest of the story forward. The boutique's air was thick with tension as Chloe stood glaring at Sarah, her mind spinning in a whirlwind of disbelief and frustration. The girl, standing in front of her with wide, pleading eyes, was still trying to explain herself, but Chloe wasn't listening. She wasn't willing to hear the truth. This girl had taken the necklace. As Sarah continued to stammer in confusion, Chloe's thoughts spiraled further into a frenzy. She couldn't fathom why anyone would dare to steal from her, let alone someone like Sarah, someone who didn't belong here. Chloe had always been so certain of her position in life, so sure of her place at the top of the social ladder, that the idea of being wrong, of being deceived, was unthinkable. Her world had always been so clear-cut. You worked hard, you earned what you deserved, and if you had enough money and status, the world bent to your will. But this was different. This wasn't how the world was supposed to work. She had never felt so shaken in her life. How dare she accuse me? How dare this girl come in here and ruin everything I've worked for? The anxiety started to build in Chloe's chest, tightening like a vice, and it quickly morphed into anger. Anger that she couldn't control. She wasn't used to feeling powerless, but in this moment she was. How could someone like Sarah just walk into her perfect world and take what she valued most? The necklace wasn't just an accessory. It was a symbol of her family's legacy, something so precious that it transcended material value. It represented everything she was. And now it was gone. Sarah, on the other hand, could feel the weight of the accusations crushing her. Every word that Chloe threw at her felt like a slap to the face. She had never once imagined herself in such a position. She had spent most of her life trying to stay invisible, to avoid drawing attention to herself, to be as small and unnoticed as possible in a world that had little use for people like her. The few times she had found solace in a store, sneaking into an aisle just to look at the pretty clothes she could never afford, had been fleeting. But now, standing in the middle of this boutique, surrounded by the glittering displays of wealth and judgment, Sarah felt more visible than she ever had in her life, and for all the wrong reasons. The words Chloe was using, thief, liar, criminal, pounded in her ears like a drumbeat. They were suffocating her, making it harder to breathe. She could feel the panic creeping up her spine, curling in her stomach like a heavy weight. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had never stolen anything in her life. She had never wanted anything that wasn't earned through hard work, no matter how difficult that work was. And yet here she was, accused of something she couldn't even comprehend. Chloe's eyes scanned Sarah's face, studying the expression for any sign of guilt. But all she saw was fear, raw, genuine fear. For the first time, she questioned her own assumptions. Could I be wrong? The thought hit her like a cold splash of water, but she immediately rejected it. There was no way she could be wrong. She had seen Sarah's nervous movements. The girl had been lingering around the jewelry display for far too long. She had noticed Chloe's necklace, and suddenly it was gone. Everything lined up too perfectly. Sarah was the thief. She had to be. The store manager, who had been standing quietly to the side, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Miss Blackwood, I think we should handle this calmly," he said, his voice laced with tension. "I'm sure we can sort this out without jumping to conclusions." Chloe's face twisted with indignation. Calmly. "You saw her." She gestured towards Sarah, her voice rising. "She's the one who took it." The manager looked uncertain, caught between trying to defuse the situation and his instinct to trust his high-profile customer. He turned to Sarah, who was now visibly trembling, her hands shaking as she wrung them together. He spoke softly to her, trying to comfort her in this bizarre moment of accusation. "Miss, why don't you explain what happened? The necklace. How did you come to have it?" Sarah's voice cracked as she tried to piece together the chaotic moments that had led to this. I didn't take it. I was just walking through the store. I don't even know how I got so close to the display. Someone bumped into me. And..." She stopped herself, unsure of how to explain the slip of the hand that had caught the necklace in her sleeve. Chloe's mind raced, but all she could focus on was the girl's unconvincing words. She had heard enough. "Don't lie." Chloe's words came out in a harsh, accusatory tone. "We all know what happened. You wanted what was mine, and now you're trying to get away with it." Her voice grew louder as the words left her lips. "You think you can just walk in here and steal from people like me, people who've worked hard to earn what they have." The shopkeeper, who had been trying to remain neutral, took a step forward. "Please, Miss Blackwood, I must insist we speak with security. There are cameras, after all. Let's see the footage before making any accusations." Chloe's face turned a shade of crimson as she reluctantly nodded, feeling the heat of embarrassment rising in her chest. She had been so sure of her accusations, but now the doubt crept in. What if I'm wrong? But no, she couldn't be. Not after everything she had experienced in her life. She had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts told her Sarah was the thief. It wasn't just the necklace. It was a matter of principle. Sarah, on the other hand, felt the walls closing in. She had hoped, just for a brief moment, that she could escape this world of judgments and accusations. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, she could be seen as someone more than the clothes on her back and the struggles in her past. But now here she was, facing the wrath of a girl who couldn't see past her own privilege. The weight of the accusation settled on her chest like a stone, and she felt smaller than ever. The manager led Sarah toward the back of the store, where the security office was located. Chloe followed, though her steps were hesitant now. She didn't want to look like the villain in this scenario, but it didn't matter. She knew she had been wronged. The footage would prove it, wouldn't it? As Sarah passed through the doors, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass. Her clothes were so torn and weathered that they barely registered in the polished reflection of the store. She hardly recognized herself. How did I end up here? She wondered. She had always been proud of who she was, but now, standing in the midst of this chaos, she felt like a ghost, someone who didn't belong anywhere, in any world. She was no longer the girl who dreamed of a better life. She was now a thief in the eyes of a privileged stranger who had never once taken the time to understand her struggle. Meanwhile, Chloe stood by the door, still fuming. She felt justified, even as the store manager gave her a glance that seemed to carry more than a little doubt. Chloe couldn't help it. Her sense of entitlement ran so deep that she couldn't see the girl as anything but a threat to her world. She was right, wasn't she? She couldn't have been wrong. The store manager's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Let's review the footage," he said, his tone more neutral than she would have liked. As the small team gathered around the screen, Chloe's heart pounded. She couldn't help but wonder if this moment would be the one where everything unraveled, where the truth came to light. Would the footage show Sarah taking the necklace, or was Chloe's world just starting to crack at the seams? The dimly lit security office was quiet except for the faint hum of the surveillance monitors and the click of the mouse as the manager pulled up the footage. Chloe stood at the back of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes focused on the screen. The tension in her body was palpable as she waited for the footage to load. Every second felt like an eternity. This would be it. This would prove everything. The store manager, a man named David, clicked a few buttons and adjusted the timeline, selecting the exact moment when Sarah had entered the boutique. His eyes flickered from the screen to Chloe, and then back again. The room felt heavy with anticipation. Chloe could feel her heartbeat in her throat, the anticipation almost unbearable. If Sarah was innocent, why did it feel so wrong? As the footage began to play, the screen flickered to life. The video showed Sarah walking into the boutique, her movements hesitant and uncertain. Chloe immediately recognized the moment. The girl had looked so out of place, so uncomfortable among the gleaming displays of designer clothing and sparkling jewelry. She had stood by the entrance for a moment, scanning the store as though trying to figure out where she was or what she could do. Sarah seemed to be lost in the world of wealth and luxury around her. She didn't appear to be stealing anything. She was simply wandering, drawn in by the allure of the store, but hesitant to engage. The footage showed her wandering past the racks of clothes, her eyes darting from item to item. She was so absorbed in the world of the store that it almost seemed like she was looking for something she could never have, perhaps just a moment of escape from the harshness of her reality. Chloe could see the unease in Sarah's body language. She wasn't being sneaky. She wasn't acting suspicious. She wasn't eyeing the jewelry display or the expensive handbags like someone planning a theft. This didn't look right. The footage continued, and the next moment that stood out was when Sarah approached the jewelry display. Chloe watched, her stomach sinking, as Sarah reached out to touch one of the glass cases, but she didn't take anything. She simply placed her hand on the glass as though admiring the necklaces, her face softening for just a second, as if imagining herself wearing one of those stunning pieces. Sarah had been drawn to the beauty, the wealth of it all, but it was clear she wasn't trying to take anything for herself. The manager, to David, paused the footage. He turned to Chloe, his expression somber but firm. "Miss Blackwood, this is where it gets interesting." Chloe blinked, still unsure of what to make of it all. This wasn't the footage she had been expecting. This wasn't what she had imagined when she accused Sarah. David clicked a few more buttons, fast-forwarding the footage a little. The next sequence of events unfolded in a way that Chloe hadn't anticipated. She watched, stunned, as a woman in an elegant fur coat, someone who clearly belonged to the same circle of privilege as Chloe, walked past Sarah. The woman was talking to someone else, and without noticing Sarah, she brushed her against the shoulder in the process. Sarah flinched, stepping back quickly, but it wasn't just her step that caused the problem. The delicate necklace from the display had somehow slipped out of the case during the encounter. It had happened so quickly that, at first, it was almost impossible to notice. The necklace had fallen towards Sarah, resting briefly in the sleeve of her coat as she instinctively reached out to steady herself. She had no idea that it had even happened. The woman in the fur coat kept walking without a second glance. Sarah was completely unaware that the necklace had fallen into her possession, thinking it was merely a product of her own erratic movement, caused by the sudden jolt of being bumped. Chloe's stomach churned. This wasn't what I thought. As she watched Sarah instinctively pull the necklace out of her sleeve, trying to remove it and place it back, she could see the panic in Sarah's face. The girl had recognized what had happened, but she hadn't stolen it. She had never meant to take anything. She had been caught up in the unfortunate turn of events. This was a misunderstanding. David spoke quietly, his voice a stark contrast to the fury that had initially dominated Chloe's thoughts. "Miss Blackwood, this is the moment where things changed. Sarah didn't steal the necklace. It simply ended up in her sleeve by accident. She was trying to put it back, but the assumption was made before she had the chance to explain." The footage showed Sarah hesitating, looking around, unsure of what to do. She had been frozen in that moment, caught in the tension between the social expectations of the boutique and the possibility of being accused of something she hadn't done. Chloe felt her breath catch in her throat, her mind racing with guilt and disbelief. How had I let this happen? The realization of what she had done, of how quickly she had assumed the worst of Sarah, settled like a heavy stone in her chest. For a long moment, Chloe stood still, staring at the footage, trying to reconcile what she had believed with the truth now unfolding in front of her. She was wrong. She was completely wrong. Sarah hadn't stolen anything. Chloe had been so blinded by her own assumptions, by her own prejudices, that she had never once considered the possibility that she could be mistaken. Chloe's thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't even know the necklace was there," Sarah said from the doorway, her voice shaky. She had been standing there, silent, watching the footage unfold just as Chloe had. She hadn't said anything since they entered the room, but now, the truth was finally out. There was no need for further explanations. The video had said it all. Chloe turned slowly to face Sarah, the words stuck in her throat. She had never felt more ashamed in her life. The anger that had surged through her earlier seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a deep sense of remorse. She couldn't look Sarah in the eyes. She was afraid of what she might see. Perhaps pity, or worse, the feeling of betrayal that came with Chloe's unspoken judgment. "Sarah," Chloe started, her voice quieter than she had expected. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I'm sorry. Chloe stopped, struggling to find the right words, but they felt so inadequate. How could she apologize for what had just transpired? How could she undo the damage done by her snap judgment, by her instant decision to accuse someone who had nothing to do with her life? Sarah met her gaze, her face still unsure, but something had shifted. The fear in her eyes had faded, replaced by a flicker of understanding. "It's okay. I get it," Sarah said quietly. "I didn't belong here. And maybe that's why you thought I took it. But I didn't. I'm not that kind of person." Her voice was calm, though Chloe could hear the tremor in it. She had never wanted this confrontation, never wanted to be seen as someone beneath the others. Chloe's heart sank further as the weight of her actions pressed down on her. She had assumed so much, too much, about Sarah and her life. Chloe had never once stopped to ask questions, to get to know her, or even to entertain the possibility that there was more to Sarah than her clothes and her circumstances. She was just another person, another soul. "Thank you for showing me the truth," Chloe said, her voice thick with emotion. She didn't know what else to say. There was so much more to be said, but nothing felt like enough. She couldn't change what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, she could do something to make it right. As Chloe's words hung in the air, Sarah gave a small, tentative smile. It wasn't one of triumph, but one of acceptance. Accepting the apology, but also accepting that people, even the privileged ones, could make mistakes. That no one was above reproach, and that it was never too late to understand the value of empathy and humility. And in that quiet, uncertain moment, a shift occurred, not just between Chloe and Sarah, but in Chloe herself. She realized that the world she had built around herself, the world that had always made her feel safe, was no longer enough. She couldn't live in a world where assumptions ruled. Not anymore. The air in the boutique felt thick with lingering tension, but also with something else, something more difficult to define. Chloe stood silently in front of Sarah, her heart heavy and full of contradictions. She had come in with a mission, with a clear sense of justice on her side, or so she had thought. But the truth had cracked her perception wide open, and now she was left standing in the aftermath, unsure of what to do with the mess she had made. She had been so quick to judge, so quick to assume that Sarah's rough appearance, her quiet demeanor, and her social class made her an outsider, someone who must be guilty of stealing. But in this single moment of reckoning, Chloe realized just how deeply her prejudices had shaped her worldview. The girl standing before her wasn't a criminal, wasn't a stereotype. She was a person, a human being with a life and struggles that were far more complicated than Chloe had ever cared to understand. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed calm, almost too calm. Her arms were folded across her chest, her eyes no longer filled with fear or nervousness, but rather a quiet strength. The initial shock of the confrontation had worn off, and now, as she looked at Chloe, there was no anger in her gaze. She wasn't upset, at least not in the way Chloe had expected. Instead, Sarah seemed resigned. Resigned to the reality that people like Chloe would always see her in a certain light, no matter what she did. The store manager, David, who had remained silent during the exchange, was the first to break the stillness. "I think we're all clear here," he said, his voice authoritative yet understanding. "No theft occurred, and the misunderstanding has been resolved." His words felt like a lifeline to Chloe, as though they were some sort of closure. But Chloe didn't feel closed in the way he seemed to think she would. No, this was just the beginning. David turned to Sarah, offering her a small smile. "I'm sorry for the trouble, miss. You're free to go whenever you're ready." Sarah gave him a curt nod, but she didn't seem eager to leave. She had expected to be thrown out. She had expected to be treated as an outsider, as an unwelcome intruder in a world she didn't belong to. But David's words, though polite, were not enough to wash away the sting of being accused, of being judged simply because of how she looked. She had felt that sting 1,000 times before, every time she had entered a store where she wasn't welcome, every time she had been overlooked for a job or forced to beg for scraps of food. Sarah had learned long ago that the world didn't care about her, or anyone like her. And in that moment, as she stood in the boutique, feeling the weight of the accusations and the quiet judgment still hanging in the air, she realized something. It wasn't just the necklace. It wasn't just the theft. It was the way people like Chloe treated people like her. It was the way society as a whole had written her off, defined her by her social standing, and never once considered her as an individual with her own worth, her own dreams, and her own story. Chloe, for her part, felt the weight of her actions press down on her. She had seen Sarah as a problem, a threat, someone to be dismissed. She had seen only her circumstances, the torn clothes, the scruffy appearance, the anxiety in her eyes. But what had she missed? What had she failed to see? How many people like Sarah had Chloe ignored throughout her life? How many people had she passed by, assuming their worth based on what they wore or how they lived, without ever stopping to listen to their story? "Sarah, wait," Chloe said, breaking the silence. Her voice was shaky, uncertain, as if she wasn't sure she had a right to speak to the girl at all, much less apologize. But she couldn't just walk away from this. Not after everything. Not after the truth had been laid bare in front of her. Sarah paused, her back still turned. She didn't look back at Chloe, but she didn't walk away either. Chloe hesitated, trying to find the words that would fix everything. But no words could ever undo the damage of her accusations. I was wrong. I judged you. I assumed the worst of you. And I'm sorry," Chloe said, her voice low but sincere. Sarah turned slowly, her eyes meeting Chloe's for the first time since the confrontation began. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps disbelief, perhaps relief, but Chloe could sense it. Sarah wasn't angry. Not at her, anyway. "I know," Sarah replied quietly. "I know you were just doing what you thought was right. I know how people like me are treated. It's not just you. It's not just today. People don't look at me and see a person. They see what they want to see. And sometimes I think it's easier for them to think I'm a criminal than it is for them to think I'm just a person who's had a hard life." Chloe blinked, struck by Sarah's words. She hadn't realized how deep the wound ran, how ingrained the judgment of people like her was in Sarah's life. She had seen it from her privileged perspective, where people like Sarah were rare, and when they were seen, it was usually through the lens of pity or disdain. But Sarah had lived this every day. Every moment of her life had been touched by people looking at her and assuming they knew her story. Chloe had been just one of many. And now she was faced with the reality that she had been just another part of that same system. How? How do you do it? Chloe asked before she could stop herself. How do you keep going, keep fighting, when the world is always against you? For the first time, Sarah allowed herself a small, sad smile. You don't have a choice. You do it because you have to. There's no other way. Chloe stood still, processing the weight of those words. She had never had to fight to survive the way Sarah had. She had never had to wake up every day wondering if she would have food, a place to sleep, or the simple dignity of being seen as a person worthy of respect. "I can't change what I've done," Chloe said softly. "But I want to help. I want to do something. Something to make things right." Sarah regarded Chloe carefully. "You don't owe me anything. But maybe you can start by seeing people like me for who we really are. Start seeing us as people, not problems." Chloe nodded, the words sinking in. She didn't know how to fix things. She didn't know what her next steps should be. But she knew one thing for certain. She could change. The days after. In the weeks that followed, Chloe's life began to shift. It wasn't an immediate transformation, and it wasn't without its struggles. Chloe had grown up in a world that had taught her to see herself as separate, as someone with more value simply because of her family's wealth and status. But now, after her encounter with Sarah, Chloe found herself questioning everything. She began volunteering at local shelters, working with people who had nowhere else to turn. It wasn't always easy. She found herself awkward in the beginning, unsure of how to interact with people who were so different from the people she was used to. But little by little, she began to understand. She began to see the humanity in each person she met. She saw the mothers who had to fight for their children's survival, the fathers who worked 3 jobs just to feed their families, the kids who had dreams bigger than the world they were born into. And with each new face, Chloe's heart softened, her walls came down, and her understanding grew. But it wasn't just about giving back. Chloe started asking questions about the systems in place that allowed poverty to exist, that allowed people to be dismissed simply because of where they came from. She began to see the world differently, not as a place where people earned what they got, but as a system that was deeply flawed, a system that needed to be re-examined and rebuilt. Meanwhile, Sarah's life took small, steady steps toward improvement as well. The encounter at the boutique had shaken her too, but not in the way Chloe had expected. For Sarah, the moment was less about forgiveness and more about understanding that she had the right to be seen as more than a stereotype. She took her small victories in stride, securing a part-time job at a local cafe, finding a more stable place to live, and beginning to rebuild the parts of herself that had been worn down by years of hardship. But there was still a long road ahead, one filled with uncertainty. Yet there was a quiet strength in Sarah's heart now, something that had been awakened by Chloe's apology and the recognition that change, even if slow, was possible. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The sun had set by the time Chloe left the community center, her volunteer shift over for the evening. She stood outside for a moment, taking in the cool evening air. The once busy streets of the city were quiet now, the hum of traffic replaced by the distant murmur of nightlife. Chloe's footsteps echoed against the pavement as she made her way down the block, her mind swirling with the events of the past few weeks. Things had changed, not just in her life, but in the way she saw the world. The shift had come so gradually, almost imperceptibly, that she wasn't sure when exactly she had begun to think differently. But there was no denying it now. The woman who had stepped into that boutique weeks ago, so certain of her privilege and her place in the world, was no longer the same person who walked these streets tonight. She had been humbled. She had been wrong. And in the process, she had learned more than she ever expected to about herself, about Sarah, and about the world they both inhabited in very different ways. Chloe's transformation. As Chloe continued her walk home, her thoughts turned inward. She thought back to the day she had accused Sarah, the anger that had surged through her as she wrongly assumed that the homeless girl was a criminal. That moment, that one misstep, had sent her spiraling into a series of realizations that shook her to her core. The apology to Sarah had been the beginning, but it had been the hardest part. Apologizing for an accusation was not an easy thing to do, especially when the layers of pride and privilege had made it so difficult to even admit she was wrong. Chloe had always been confident, some would even say arrogant, in her own righteousness. She had been taught that she was deserving of everything she had, that she was entitled to the best, simply by virtue of who she was and who she was born to be. But the truth was that very entitlement had kept her from understanding the struggles of others, from seeing beyond the surface of her own narrow world. Volunteering at shelters and community centers had been eye-opening. She had learned about the systemic issues that contributed to poverty and homelessness, but what truly opened her eyes was the realization that people are not their circumstances. Everyone had a story. Every person who walked into the shelter, every person who came seeking help, had dreams, had needs, had a heart that beat the same way hers did. At first she had been uncomfortable. She had felt out of place among the people she was trying to help, as though she didn't belong there. But as the days passed, Chloe began to change. She started connecting with the people who came to the shelter, not as a rich girl trying to save them, but as someone who was finally starting to see them for who they really were. There was Lisa, a single mother of 2 young children, who had been struggling to find stable work ever since she'd lost her job. Then there was Marcus, a young man who had been living on the streets for years, but who still held on to the dream of one day opening his own small business. And finally, there was Thomas, an elderly man who had been a Vietnam War veteran and had no family left to turn to. Each of these people had a story that mattered, and Chloe realized how much she had missed in her own life by staying inside her bubble, too focused on herself to see what was happening around her. Chloe's sense of entitlement began to fade as she saw the strength and resilience of the people she encountered. They were not less than her. They were not problems to be fixed or pitied. They were people, whole, complex, and deserving of respect. The first time she had witnessed a woman who had been homeless for years finally get a job offer, Chloe had felt something she'd never experienced before: pride. But this pride wasn't born from something she had achieved herself. It was born from witnessing someone else's victory, someone who had fought against the odds to find hope again. It was then that Chloe realized how much more she had to learn. She had spent her life looking at the world through a lens of privilege, convinced that her success was due to her own inherent worth, and that others simply had to work harder if they wanted the same. But the truth was, it wasn't that simple. The world wasn't just about working hard, it was about opportunity, and it was about having the resources, the support, and the circumstances to make things happen. Chloe had been lucky, but luck was not the same thing as deserving. Deserving was something that no one could define by wealth, by status, or by birthright. It was something that had to be earned through empathy, through understanding, and through the willingness to see others as human beings. And in the weeks since that day in the boutique, Chloe had learned how to truly see. Sarah's journey. While Chloe was undergoing her transformation, Sarah's life had also begun to shift, though in a quieter, more subtle way. The events at the boutique had stirred something within her, but not in the way Chloe had hoped. At first, Sarah had been angry at the way she had been treated, angry that Chloe had assumed she was a thief. But the more she reflected on the incident, the more Sarah realized that her anger wasn't just about Chloe or the boutique. It was about a system that had written her off long before she ever stepped foot inside that store. Sarah had spent years feeling invisible to the world. She had spent years feeling like she didn't matter, like she was nothing more than a problem to be solved. And yes, the accusation in the boutique had stung deeply. But there was something else that had stuck with her, something that had softened the blow. Chloe's apology had been unexpected, and in that moment, Sarah had realized something that she hadn't before. She had the right to be seen as a person, not as a charity case, not as a statistic, but as a person with her own worth. Chloe's apology had opened a door in Sarah's mind, and through that door, she saw the possibility of something she had never allowed herself to believe before. She deserved more. In the days that followed, Sarah had decided to take small steps toward reclaiming control of her life. She found a job at a local cafe, part-time at first, but it was enough. She was working, earning her own money, and finally feeling like she had something to offer. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. Slowly, she began to rebuild her life. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of her past threatened to crush her. But Sarah was no stranger to hardship. She had endured more than most could imagine, and each day she kept moving forward was a victory in itself. What Sarah hadn't expected, however, was the change that had taken place within her. She had always been resilient, but now she felt empowered. She no longer felt like she was a victim of her circumstances. She no longer felt like she was defined by the harshness of her past. She had realized that she had a future that she could build, one step at a time. She still carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, but now she was walking with her head held a little higher. She had learned that the world may not always see her as she saw herself, but that didn't matter. What mattered was how she saw herself, and that had changed. Full circle, a shared understanding. Months passed, and the paths of Chloe and Sarah crossed again, though this time it was different. Chloe was no longer just the rich girl who had accused Sarah. She had become someone who understood the complexities of life, the subtleties of human experience, and the necessity of empathy. One afternoon, Chloe was at a community event at the shelter where she volunteered, helping to organize a fundraiser for the homeless. As she stood in front of a table of donations, arranging items for auction, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Sarah standing there, a small smile on her face. "Hey," Sarah said softly, her voice warm but not overly familiar. "I just wanted to say thank you. For everything. For what you did that day. I didn't expect it, but it meant more than you know." Chloe met Sarah's gaze, and for the first time, they were not just two women from different worlds. They were equals. "Thank you," Chloe said, her voice full of sincerity. "I've learned a lot since then. About you, about myself, and about what really matters." The two women stood together, side by side, silently understanding the long, painful journey they had both been on. They had both changed, had both come to realize that the world they lived in was far more complex than they had ever thought. But in this moment, standing in the glow of the community event, they both knew one thing for sure: change was possible. They had seen each other in ways that no one else had, and in that understanding, they found a bond that transcended everything that had once divided them.